Blood and Genetics by Gara Hobbit of Zadia on Wattpad. Chapter 7, Flames of the Past. Mr. Harris was droning on about fire again. Keith watched the empty desk carefully, waiting for it to burst into flames. He was not disappointed. This time, he got up, grabbed the fire extinguisher, and put it out. Mr. Harrison gaped at him. Kugane, is that not the correct procedure to put out a fire in a plane, sir? Well, yes. Keith saluted and sat back down. Mr. Harris cleared his throat. Well, that covers the basics. So, we'll be headed down to the simulators to practice in a more realistic situation. There was a relieved cheer, and the cadets started lining up at the door. They marched down to the simulator room, and Mr. Harris called names by alphabet, starting with Garrett Hunk. Hunk gulped and went into the simulator. A few minutes later, he stumbled out, green and nauseous. Mr. Harris sighed, barely looking up from his phone, where he monitored the inside of the simulator. Fail. Griffin, James. Griffin entered the simulator, his face pale. After a minute, the door opened, and he came out, white-faced and shaken. Mr. Harris gave him a look. Pass, but barely. You performed the correct procedure, but you panicked. He called one of the girls in their flight group, who did moderately well, but then, Kugane, Keith. Keith entered the simulator and sat down at the controls. He piloted it as normal, soaring through the blue sky, and then something burst into flames. A student being set outside through a window by a pair of hands that Keith knew to be his father's. The whole building collapsing in on itself, flames burning bright, being held back by teachers as he attempted to run towards the burning building, screaming for his father but getting no answer. Keith jumped in the steering wheel and steered the plane into a nosedive before reserting control and putting the plane into autopilot. He jumped out of his seat, going for the fire extinguisher, but a warning light told him that the plane was unstable because of something or other that was burning. And the simulator gave an almighty heave that sent him crashing into a wall and smacking his head on the fire extinguisher they were supposed to use. After a dizzying moment where all he could see was stars, he seized the fire extinguisher and finished the job. The simulator let him out, and Mr. Harris gave him a frown. Pass. Barely. You nearly crashed. Go get that bump on your head checked out by the med bay. Keith nodded and left as Mr. Harris called the next name. McLean Lance. Keith, I want to talk to you. Keith stopped at the door of Mr. Harris's classroom, turning around to face him. They were the only ones left in the classroom. Yes, sir? Are you doing all right? I'm fine. What happened in the simulator today? I panicked. It won't happen again, sir. Mr. Harris eyed him. You're very bright, Keith, and you've got good reflexes. How fast you managed to pull out of that nosedive is a testament to that. Keith said nothing, waiting for the but or the so why. So why don't you ever do your homework? I know that you're smart enough to complete the work, and you've clearly done the reading and know the material. So why don't you ever do your assignments? You could do very well if you would just, sir, if you would just try harder. Is that all, sir? Mr. Harris sighed. That's all, Keith. Keith left the room. Griffin was outside. This is getting creepy. It's not like I stalked you. I'm part of this class, too. Why can't you just leave me alone? Are you looking to get your face rearranged? Griffin threw his hands up. Maybe I just want to talk. Maybe I just want to have a normal conversation with you. You're so suspicious all the time. Gee, I wonder why. It's not like you haven't ever gotten in a fight with me before. Griffin got a smug look on his face. I'm not the one who throws the first punch. Keith shouldered his backpack and started walking away, internally counting to 10. 1 Mississippi. 2 Mississippi. 3 Mississippi. 4 Mississippi. 5 Mississippi. Hey, was your dad at that fire at the school? Back in first grade? 6. The school collapsing in on itself, his father still inside. That's it. Keith swung around and flung his backpack into Griffin's stomach, feeling a little glimmer of satisfaction through his blind rage when Griffin let out a whoosh of air. Keith slammed a fist into Griffin's face. The other boy fell down, and Keith glared down at him. You shut up about my father. Tears of rage and pain spilled out of Keith's eyes, and he didn't care. He didn't care if Griffin saw them. He didn't care if Mr. Harrison heard him and sent him to Iverson. It's your fault! Griffin wiggled away, keeping his distance from Keith. I was just asking, he said defensively. He went back in to save you. Keith half screamed, half sobbed. You were too stupid or too scared to come out with the rest of the class. You ran the wrong way. You got stuck in the burning building. You are the reason that he's dead. Griffin, on the ground, dazed and crying, while the building collapsed in on his savior. Going back to school and seeing the kid who'd gotten his father killed and having to act like everything was normal and pretend that he was fine, and seeing Griffin walk around like nothing had happened and like he wasn't the reason that Keith's entire world had been flipped upside down. Walking around as if he weren't the reason that Keith was now sharing a room with 4 other boys, all of whom were loud, obnoxious, and called him a little girl because of his hair. As if he weren't the reason that Poe and all of Keith's things were out of his reach. As if he weren't the reason that Keith was in a house where no one cared where he was or what he was doing. A house where no one cared about him at all. Keith turned heel and ran, trying to get as far away from Griffin as possible. He darted through the hallway, eyes half closed, because he was sure that his eyes weren't normal, and some small part of him knew that he shouldn't be letting people know about that. He sprinted past the dorms, turning through hallways instinctively and letting his feet take him wherever they were going. Everyone was loud, as if someone had hit an amplify button on his ears, and he could hear every word. He found himself at the botany labs, and he fumblingly typed in the code that Katie had given him, running through the labs and into the greenhouse. The door shut behind him, and all of the noises abruptly stopped, leaving him in a quiet, safe green haven. Quiet, safe, nothing to hurt you here, no one here. Keith wandered through the greenhouse, the quiet freshness of it soothing his frazzled nerves. He found a massive tree and stretched towards the ceiling, and he clambered over its roots until he found a small hollow at the base of the tree's trunk. He fit in it perfectly, and he curled up inside of it, leaning back against the great trunk. Quiet. Safe, the tree seemed to say. Stay. Safe. Keith could practically feel the tree thrumming with life. Quiet. Safe. Griffin rubbed at his jaw where Keith had hit him, his mind reeling. Shrill fire alarms going off, running to save the picture he'd drawn because he'd won a prize, and his parents were so proud. It was probably just a drill, but just in case. Looking around and seeing nothing but flames coughing from all the smoke, fire everywhere, nowhere safe. Curling into a ball on the floor, crying. A man, a firefighter, pushing through the flames and scooping him up, talking to him soothingly. Being set outside through a window, dazed and crying moments before the building collapsed. Griffin shook his head, wincing as his jaw throbbed. He'd never known the name of that man who had saved him. He'd never known who he was. He knew that his savior had died in the collapse, but he'd never known the name. Keith's dad. Griffin had suspected when he learned that Keith's father had been a fireman, but, well, that explained why he blew up every time that Griffin had mentioned his parents. He'd never known Keith well. He'd always been just sitting quietly in the corner, and he rarely played with the others on the playground. He hadn't been surprised when he learned that Keith had no parents, but he'd never have guessed that Keith's father was the one who saved him, who'd given his own life to save Griffin's. Griffin got up, his stomach sore from where the backpack had hit him. Okay, I deserve that, he thought ruefully. Although it had been a legitimate question, he had wanted to know whether Keith's father had been there, but still, he deserved that, at least a little bit. Mr. Harris came out of his classroom, apparently oblivious to the whole scene that had happened right outside his classroom, and immediately tripped over Keith's abandoned backpack. Griffin! Yes, sir. Whose bag is this? Mine, sir. Well, get it out of the middle of the hallway. Griffin scooped up Keith's bag fluidly. Yes, sir. He hightailed it before Mr. Harris could ask any more questions. Keith glanced up as the warning for curfew rang. He didn't want to leave. It was cozy here. Safe. Quiet. Away from Griffin and his weird stalker tendencies. Keith briefly entertained the thought of just telling Griffin what was going on to get him off his back, but he dismissed the idea. He was lucky to have gotten away with telling Katie, and Griffin probably wouldn't keep his stupid mouth shut, unlike Katie. He got up from the roots of the tree, stretching and walking towards the door, but back into the noise and bustle of the labs. None of the scientists noticed him, all of them too occupied with their plants to see him. Keith slipped out of the labs and strode towards the dorms, rubbing his eyes with a yawn. The greenhouse was nice, quiet, away from people. The library had been quiet too, but there had still been people who called him a psychopath. Keith shook his head, clearing his thoughts, and opened the door to his room. His backpack was sitting on his bed, and he realized with a start that he hadn't picked it up after he'd thrown it at Griffin. He frowned. Who had brought it back? His stomach recoiled at the thought that Griffin might have been holding his backpack and had been able to dig through his things to look for anything that might prove Keith's condition. Keith opened the bag, but everything looked exactly the same as when he left it. He frowned. What game was Griffin playing? Iverson leaned back in his chair. So, has your little genius found anything out yet? Colleen shook her head. Still working on it. She says she says to give her a week or two because there's a lot of information to go through. How is it on your end? Still no confirmation on the metal that knife is made of, and the language experts are still baffled. But at least that obnoxious cadet had given up asking about it. What exactly is your daughter doing to figure out the meaning? Well, first she asked Keith. What? How did she even know to ask him? Did you tell her everything? I didn't. Keith did. He what? Hold on, before you take any drastic measures, we never told Keith to keep the secret. At least, I didn't. Did you? No, Iverson grumbled. He wasn't ordered not to tell anyone, so he wasn't exactly breaking orders, was he? I suppose not. And seeing as how they are Keith's genetics, he is within his rights to tell whomever he pleases, provided that he wasn't given orders not to tell. Yes. There then. You can order him not to tell anyone from here on out, but his enlightening of Katie was perfectly legal, no punishment. Wouldn't be smart to punish him anyway. We can't kick him out, because then we'd lose control of our only link to possible extraterrestrial life. Right. So then, asking Kagane was a dead end? Colleen nodded. He doesn't know. Or isn't telling her, anyway. He could be lying. Katie doesn't think that he's lying. She didn't tell him that we'd asked her to find out what it meant. She acted like she happened upon the picture and was curious as to what it was. Iverson grunted. That wasn't very honest of her. As far as she's concerned, this is a matter of stealth. If she has to lie to get the information she wants, then she'll do it. Iverson shook his head. And she's 10? She's very mature. And devious. That too. Colleen rubbed her temples. Sometimes I wonder if I should have stayed at home with her. If maybe the reason she's so cutthroat is because neither I nor her father were around enough to teach her otherwise. Well, in this instance, it's working out in our favor. I know, but still. She might have a place here, if she can figure out She might have a place here, if she can figure this out when none of our language experts have been able to find the answer. She's only 10, Iverson. She may be smart, but she's still a child. A child who would be out of her depth if she were placed with kids much older than her. If she's so vulnerable, do you think she's up for this task? Colleen smiled. Have a little faith in Katie, Commander. She'll pull through. And if she doesn't, then we'll be no worse off than we already are. Colleen smiled again. And if she does pull through, then we might be further ahead than we could have ever dreamed. That knife could be our key to finding life beyond Earth.